Awesome. So I do have to give just a brief spiel. I hope that everyone is familiar with TPE, but if you are not, on behalf of the Placement Exchange, we welcome you to joining us this afternoon for a conversation around supervision and what it is like to be supervised by someone, what supervisees need to feel successful and to thrive in the field. My name is Denaja Pendergrass Thomas. I'm the new director of the Placement Exchange. The Placement Exchange, better known as TPE, is a collaborative partnership between ACU Hawaii and NASPA. We are the place where both organizations hope that we can talk about the job placement process and the factors that influence that. Most people know TPE for the 4-day event that happens in the spring, typically in March. There's hundreds of employers, hundreds of candidates. We all kind of get together and have interviews for hours and hours upon end. And hopefully that leads to employers finding what we like to call the ideal candidate, and for candidates in finding what we would like to call the ideal employer. That event will continue to happen virtually from this year moving on. We're excited about that, knowing that it will be different than what a lot of us are familiar with if you've gone through the process. But our hope is that in having it virtually, we can expand the opportunity for people to engage. TPE is typically held at the site where NASPA is, which means West Coast folks have had to travel from California all the way to Baltimore, or folk have had to go from North Carolina all the way over to San Antonio and vice versa. Having the platform be virtual means that we can make it more accessible. We also know and have encountered those grad students who are 4 and 5 to a room, who have saved their assistantship money to get airfare or rental cars to get to TPE. Moving virtually means that they can simply register for $25 and join from computer access and have the opportunity to meet with employers from across the country to find that first job fresh out of grad school. So access is a huge priority for us this year moving forward, and affordability is the case as well. We know that we will see some schools that we are familiar with having. We're also excited to welcome small colleges and universities and even community colleges, because the price point now puts TPE in their budget. And so when we talk about diversity, we really do mean the depth and breadth of that, the candidate and institution that can be present and participate in the process. The second piece that is a change or a shift in TPE is TPE Talks. We are looking at opportunities to not just talk about the exchange of job placement, but to really talk about some of the factors that influence the institutions we look at working, the questions we want to ask candidates, and factors that impact retention and advancement in our profession. And so when the committee talked about the idea for TPE Talks, supervision is where they wanted to start. We all know supervision can shape how long you stay at a job, whether you advance at a job, whether you even say yes to the job. And so last week we spent some time with supervisors talking about their experience. And this week we're going to have an opportunity to talk about what it is like being supervised. So without further ado, I'm going to go on mute, and I will allow today's conversationalists to introduce themselves to you, and then we'll get started with our conversation. Nisa, you happen to be in the top left corner, so why don't you get us started?
Good morning, everyone. I am Nisa Julian. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Success and Integrated Support Services at San Diego Miramar College. It is a community college in Southern California.
Awesome. Chandler?
How's it going, everyone? My name is Chandler Crean. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Georgia and a grad assistant in our Greek Life office.
Wonderful. Glad to have you. James.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon now. My name is James. My pronouns are he, him, his. I work at Can University as an academic advisor in the Center for Advising, Persistence, and Success. And I'm really happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you, James. Carson.
Howdy, friends. My name is Carson Flynn. I use the he series of pronouns. I am a residence coordinator at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina.
Wonderful. And Harriet.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harriet Williams. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Director for Talent Management at Wake Forest University in the Division of Campus Life.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all for joining us. We are excited and glad to have you here. So let's get the conversation started. The series is called Supervision Matters. So why does supervision matter?
I mean, I think what you said earlier, Danaja, that, it makes or breaks the experience for someone. I think, you know, I would say that most people have had like mediocre managers versus really good ones. And I say that because we can probably name all of our really good managers and what made them really good for us. And then we can probably also name the ones that just didn't work out very well for us. And I think it also, because the manager is the person who is most directly in contact with you on a regular basis, that colors and shapes your experience. So I think it's, having a good manager or developing your manager into a good manager for you is really important for your experience.
I would agree a lot with what Harriet said. I feel like too, in a time where it is challenging, I think, to keep and retain good employees. I think that supervision is particularly salient right now as a field where a lot of people go into for passion and their enjoyment. I think that as a supervisor, it is very paramount to focus both on the student experience and on the supervisee experience, recognizing you have a capacity so much to shape someone's professional journey, but also have the capacity to impact their longevity in a field that is very quickly losing good qualified people.
I would agree with Carson going off that. I think coming in as a graduate student now, definitely having a good supervisor will play a huge part in, one, reassuring that we're entering the right field and doing the work that we want to do, and then also providing us the understanding, the knowledge and skills really for the field and how to be successful. So I think that's where for us coming in, I'll speak on like graduate students, that's where it's really important now just to ensure we're doing the work that we want to, and that we're going to be successful once we get into that role and once we start to supervise someone in the future.
And just to kind of build off of that, supervision, you're really helping to create the culture and the environment that you want to see for yourself and for your students. And so, making sure that you have a supervisor that understands what your experiences have been, what experiences you bring to the table, and the talent that you have, and future goals, I think, is really important.
Yes, and I definitely agree with what everyone said. I was just going to say, I think that supervision, good supervision really allows us to show up as our best selves. And by doing so, we're able to really, like exactly what Nessa said, create a culture that kind of, it trickles down from from supervisor to supervisee to student staff to students, and really allows everyone to feel appreciated and supported. So,
Well, you've given us a lot to start with, and something that you all said, most all of you in your statement, a good supervisor. So here's my question. What makes a supervisor good?
I think personally, I think the one word that comes to mind right when I think about good supervision is empathy, and meeting you where you are. I know it's become such a cliche statement right now to say we're in unprecedented times. But as I sit here with a mask in front of you all, I'm reminded of kind of some of the things that we're dealing with now. So I think especially now, um, having the ability to empathize and put yourself in other people's situations and understand where people are coming from is super important. And I think that above all right now, that's very important, to be able to empathize with the people you're supervising.
And I'll add, the kind of three things came to mind for me. I think communication skills and being able to give kind of that clear and concise kind of direction in the field, and then also the positive and how to, I say feedback positively. And I think that also how to give that constructive feedback and kind of advice there for individuals, but then also just overall positive attitude and that relationship that's being built between the two. I'll say in the supervisee and the supervisor role, but then also being resourceful. So I think that's where it really plays a huge part, as we mentioned previously, how it will help shape kind of that culture in the direction of your office and kind of staff.
And then to add on to that, having a supervisor who can advocate for you and the areas that you oversee, and to also help you navigate the unknown. If you're stepping into a new position, a new institution, you don't know the campus culture. And many times, or oftentimes, your supervisor knows the history or what has worked and what hasn't worked. But still helping you understand the nuances of certain policies, procedures, but helping you still lead in your area, but understanding that background information to really, move a decision forward, et cetera. So that, to me, I found has been really important.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. I think the two big things for me that are particularly present in good supervisors is having a high degree of emotional intelligence to the point where you can discern the things that I as a supervisee need, both reflectively and in the moment, right? Having the ability to push me and challenge me to think about the things that I am doing in regards to supervising and managing my team, interacting with students in moments where it is pivotal for me to reflect on challenging situations or where I might need to adjust and change my path. I think that supervisors that have been able to do that in ways that resonate well with me as an individual, not just as a supervisee, I think is particularly important because everybody has different baggage, lived experiences, communication styles, ways that they best receive information. And supervisors that are willing to cater to that, but also challenge me to see things from different perspectives, I think are ones that do an exceptionally good job. I think as well, something else that makes supervisors particularly good is people who are willing to push the envelope in ways where they're challenging me as a supervisee to see into their decision-making process. Because as generally supervisors are people that I am aspiring to be or I am looking for guidance and supervision and that next step in the field for me. And for me, getting the ability to get a little bit of perspective about what their decision-making process is when they make a decision that I don't agree with, or when they're put in a challenging spot, being able to process through that with them or have an ability to discuss with them why they made the decision that they did, I feel helps me grow a lot as a supervisee and understand the perspective that they're coming from. And that is what I'm wanting out of a supervisor, right? Somebody that is invested in my growth and development. And when somebody is willing to be vulnerable about, I made this decision, it didn't work out very well, or this is why I took the steps that I did in this decision that you didn't agree with, it gives a level of transparency and authenticity that makes me buy into my own experience more and trusting my supervisors doing the best job that they can. And I think it brings out that humanity aspect a little bit that sometimes gets lost in supervision. Sorry, that was very monologue-y.
No, you all gave us a lot of meat to sit with. I'm taking copious notes because there are a couple of things that I want to come back to. Nisa, you started to touch on the ability and the role of the supervisor to advocate. And I would say that is a buzzword that is very frequently used. But I think that advocacy looks differently and feels differently depending on who you're in conversation with. And so I would love to hear from you all if you're willing to share when you have wanted your supervisor or needed a supervisor to advocate for you. What did that mean for you in particular? And then just to push that a little bit, how can a supervisor hold intention individual advocacy? And then remembering that they're responsible for a team of individuals and kind of that necessity to think about what's for the benefit of the team or for the unit too. Does my question make sense? I see some nodding. Okay.
I think when I think about a time when this is like most recent for me actually, and directly related to COVID. So when the whole COVID response started, my role switched to managing our contact tracer team for the university. And I don't know how it was on your campuses, but there was a lot of confusion, lots of mixed messages, lots of hands and people in the kitchen and cooking in the same pots, and all with like different purposes, right? And so for me, managing a team of remote folks, many of whom I'd never met before, and asking them to all get on board with the same purpose, it was really important for my manager to, number one, understand the why behind that, and then to know who the people were that needed to respond, right? So when COVID happened, I'd literally been at Wake for maybe 6 or 7 months. So I didn't know anybody except for whoever was in my department, maybe a handful of people in the division. And so my, like, just not knowing anyone and not knowing, where to find resources or who should answer certain questions, it was really important for my manager to hear me and to be responsive and to also like follow up. So if there were things that I was asking for that couldn't happen, then communicating that to me honestly was really important to, and key to my ability to be successful and also adjust my expectations. I think there was definitely a time where we were in a team meeting where I ugly cried in a Zoom meeting because it was pretty intense. And just having someone not be afraid of like my emotional response to the pressure, and then also setting some boundaries for me in a time where I felt like I needed to be responsive and I needed to be available and all of those things. And so having a manager who could maybe sort of read between the lines and say, okay, Harriet, I think you need to take like the afternoon and just, just do you, right? Like those things were really important. So I think someone mentioned like the emotional, intelligence, like that being able to, like, I can sort of encapsulate all of those things under this idea of coaching. And so being able to sort of read the room and see that maybe my needs might be different from someone else on the team in that moment, and really like advocating for what my needs were in that moment was really important.
I think for me, I have a couple examples, right? So we never had an equity office on campus. And so we recently established an equity office, which we're very proud of. However, having a supervisor help advocate for the creation of this office, but what it means in terms of, okay, we're not just doing this just because it's the right thing to do, right? But you need the resources, you need the personnel, you need to have the support structure in place. You need to make sure that we have, we establish the intention behind it and ways in which we need to connect the campus around what we're doing for equity and for our students. And having a supervisor help make sure that that is, all of those different things are addressed, and helping to establish the connections across campus to really make that happen, help build that foundation is really important. But then also advocating for the limitations now once that office has been created, like, whoa, just because we have a space does not remove everybody else's responsibility around equity, right? And so helping to navigate those conversations and finding that right balance. And so for me, that was, a big piece of my supervisor in advocating for, yes, the creation of this office, of this space, and establishing, the resources, but also establishing boundaries and expectations across the board, that it is a shared responsibility that we all have. And so that was we're still navigating that, it's not perfect, but it's important enough to have our supervisor, make sure that those conversations are happening, and it's not just, okay, we did it, we checked it off the box. It's ongoing, and it's always a conversation that we're talking about, and there's action behind it. So that's the advocacy piece. One example of advocacy on the part of my supervisor in my college.
Awesome. There's no pressure for everyone to answer every question. So I appreciate that. And in the context of TPE, right, when we are having conversations with employers, I always say to folks, you are interviewing the institution as much as they are interviewing you. Oftentimes, candidates can come into a situation, and depending on the market and how things are looking, we're just so glad to have the opportunity to interview. We're just so glad that someone has called us or emailed us or invited us. And that can be true. And you still need to critically engage with that process. And so one question to think about when you have the opportunity to ask employers, advocacy is very important to me. Talk to me about how you see advocacy being a part of your role as a supervisor, and allow them to answer back or say, what have your experiences been like with having supervisors advocate for you? Because that can help you, A, understand semantically when we say advocate, are we on the same page, right? Are we talking about the same thing? And B, once they do elaborate with how you view your role, including advocacy, does that align with what I think I'm looking for in a supervisor? Is it close enough that that can work out and grow as I develop there? Or are we too far apart for that to match with me as your employee and you as my supervisor? So I appreciate you all giving some context on the fact that advocacy can look different across institution, across role, and depending on who your supervisor is. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and Santiago added to this, you all gave good conversation around a supervisor being empathetic, understanding the need of their supervisee, and being able to support that, embrace that, engage with that with some humility and some empathy. I think, Carson, you touched on it, and this matches Santiago's question, that balance of also pushing you, right, from that place. And you may not want to use the word push, but the word of your choice. I would love to hear from you all if you want to talk a little bit more about how you have experienced and what your ideal balance between challenge and support looks like in supervision for you to be successful.
Yeah, I think it's so important for supervisors to challenge their supervisees in a lot of different ways. I think that a lot of times we come into roles and we think we're prepared for it, and then new opportunities arise for things that we might not be comfortable with. But being able to have those honest conversations with our supervisor, but also being given the opportunity to try something new, to try new things, I think is a good way for supervisors to challenge their supervisees to experience new things, but doing it in a way that I think Carson talked a little bit about this, was kind of doing it in a way that's going to be that you're going to understand why they're challenging you, or why they're trying to, if you thought one way, why explaining it in a way that shows that it's generally from a place of care and for your own professional development. So I think challenging generally is super important.
I think about myself in this perspective in terms of how I challenge folks that I supervise, and think for me, it's all in the setup, right? So when I'm onboarding a new person, one of the things that I generally say is, my job is to teach you how to take my job, right? So because particularly if you're coming in an entry-level position, my hope is that you do want to grow, right? And so it doesn't help me, it doesn't help our unit, it doesn't help, our divisional goals, whatever, continue to like float that out. It doesn't help anyone if all I allow you to do are the things that, are specifically in your job description. So, so for me, that means if I'm working on a project that impacts our work, why not invite you to partner with me in that work, right? And because I think that even those small, if that's how we want to categorize that, those small gains of knowledge help to grow the individual, and it helps them to, because success builds on success, right? So if you're able to experience success with something that maybe is not a general skill or muscle that you've had to exercise, then it gives you additional skill sets that you can add to your resume and your own professional growth. So I'm one of those people who really does I try to be as collaborative as possible with my team. They're like, your title is cool, and certainly I want you to get your work done, but I also want you to be able to be prepared for whatever your next opportunity is.
See, I think for me, the navigating between challenge and support, a lot of it like filters into that emotional intelligence that I was mentioning earlier, of recognizing like, as a supervisee, what do I need? When do I need it? I think also something that gets cast to the wayside a little bit in higher ed, particularly in challenging perspectives, is the best supervisors that I've had have been ones that have been willing to help me challenge and understand some of the cyclical nature of higher ed, right? There's the academic year, and certain things generally happen at certain times. Student goes through orientation at the same time. Closing residence halls has to happen at the same time, like summer term, like J term. Like there are things that are innately chronologically locked in our field. And generally, there are a lot of things for me that I find myself not focusing on because they are in very heavy times, right? Like, this is the point in time when we're going to do the closing, and it is all hands on deck for residence life and housing. You're not going to focus on anything. You're not going to process a whole lot. You're just going to get students out of their residence hall rooms and get the buildings closed down. Being able to reflect on that, which is something that I'm doing now, is something that is, I think, very challenging. And the supervisors that I have found have done really best in like challenging and supporting me have found a good balance in being able to support me in the moment and still provide opportunity for forethought and reflection about some of those chronologically locked events that occur in our field in all different divisions, in being able to help understand and process ways for improvement for that, for me as a supervisee, because those are the times where I'm the most hectic, right? The least composed and am needing the most support. But that doesn't mean that there's not growth that can happen there. It just might not be able to happen in the moment as much. So I think that really stellar supervisors have the ability to preempt that, and also provide like ample reflection for those experiences.
I appreciate you all sharing on that. Those are some good nuggets there. Staying with that, talking about the depth of conversation, explaining things, unpacking and giving insight, inviting folk into spaces. I want to come back to the statement that was made about a good supervisor being one who is willing to give you the opportunity to see into their decision-making process. As someone who has been a mid-level supervisor in my mid-30s, my peers have talked about the tension of reporting to folk who are in a generation who have been able to function under directive. That was just the conditioning. People could make decisions and you could learn to accept those decisions, get on board or not. And a statement that flat could work. Except that now as mid-levels, we hear that some decisions are made and passed down that way, but you supervise folk who are like, this directive that you speak of doesn't work for me. The meaningfulness of the relationship of supervisee and supervisor is really met in that willingness to say, this is the decision, this is the ways in which I could advocate or the influence that I did have, this is where I did not, and this is where we landed. I think it was Carson, to your point, that helps you as a supervisee at least know how your supervisor is thinking, where they're working. Let's talk a little bit about being in a field where in the chain of decision-making processes, there is some tension with how to embrace that directives can and do happen, and the rate of change in that process is very long. And you all finding meaning in your relationship with your supervisor because of their ability to be open and transparent about decision-making and even invite you into decision-making. What advice can you give, or do you have, and how you have navigated decision-making processes at your institutions and how your supervisor has navigated that?
You know, that's a fascinating question because I find myself as a member of the directive generation, like thinking about how the expectations, particularly from people coming into the field from graduate programs, has begun to shift that a bit. And I think, you know, certainly there, like in every place that we are professionally or personally, there will be decisions that we can't influence the outcome for. And so I think the ability to empathetically listen and hear people's thought processes around things. So to give an example, right now, Wake has given managers the flexibility to create flexible work plans, you know, in the wake of COVID, and within our division, we have adapted our own process. And I got to be, as the director of talent management here, I got to be the person who authored that. And so, you know, just in putting this plan together, I understood really clearly that there were parts of our division that would probably not be able to take advantage of this opportunity. So thinking about people who live on, and people who are in administrative roles where, you know, their job is to say hello to people when they walk through the door, our university police, our student health center, you know, the list can continue, right? So the ability to have, like, to hear people's feedback was really important in that process, because certainly I could sit in my office and write a policy or, you know, a plan and share that and say, here you go, people. But I wanted to make sure that we were being sensitive to how these different areas in our division operate, and how the function of their work operates differently. And so I think that the ability to even if you can't actually do anything about the directive that's come from above that you have to do, you know, that you have to follow, there are still, you can still listen, right? Because I don't know, for me, COVID is pretty fluid. Things are changing all the time. And so that directive could change at some point. And maybe there's the point where we can provide some input into that process because we've already collected that feedback and that information. And I think, you know, just the ability to empathetically listen to what people have to say, because you know, my lived experience is probably different from other people's lived experiences because they live in different houses and they have different family structures and, you know, all of those things. And I think it would have been a mistake for us to not provide spaces where people could tell us what would be helpful to them versus just being really prescriptive about it and saying, this is what we're going to do. And I think it's such an interesting time to be in higher ed. I remember years ago, we won't say how many, I was co-teaching a HESA course, and a grad student said, they were working in Res Life as a grad student, and they said, I just want to have work-life balance. And I was like, what is this thing you talk about? Like, what? This is higher ed. We are above work-life balance. And I literally had to think about that and say, no, actually, what you're saying is accurate. And so I think that, like, as you're moving into higher ed, you have like a really good opportunity to impact what your work life looks like by offering feedback, and certainly doing that in an appropriate way, but also demanding that of managers, because for those of us who are generationally a little bit older, we need to hear that, and so that we can be responsive to it, because the impact that it's having on retention at this point is huge. And and if we can't figure out how to pivot and listen to that information, we're going to lose some really valuable human talent in this field.
So to add to that a little bit, kind of from the different perspectives. So I'm kind of like that middle ground between millennial and Gen Z, kind of entering the workforce now in higher ed. And as Gen Z of an answer as I could give, I've recently seen a lot of TikToks that have talked about the importance of work-life balance and how this generation is very likely um, to prioritize work-life balance over anything else. And I very much agree with that, at least from my perspective. While as a higher ed professional, I adore students, I adore the field, and I'm very thankful to be in the field. I do recognize that I have a limited time here on this earth. We're reminded of our humanity quite often these days. And I think that for me, I think about how important being able to live my life is. And that I think I would be happier having a good work-life balance with, a sensible mid-level position than just constantly for, 50 years straight, just trying to climb the ladder and eventually get to a place where I'm able to work 80 hours a week when I'm 80 years old. That doesn't sound appealing to me. So I think that at one point that might have sounded a little bit appealing to some people. But learning from TikTok, I can say that that might not be the case moving forward.
Absolutely. I think you all are hitting the nail on the head. And some of the notes I was taking when I think about the interview conversation, right? Where is there space to say, sometimes we say, well, how are decisions made? But I think the second part of that question is, and communicated. Because then you're able to hear more about the process as opposed to, well, we take feedback, people are allowed to X, Y, and Z, right? Well, how are they made and communicated? Because then you can start to hear a little bit more about how they are mediated, who is at the table, how and why, to give you more of an accurate understanding of the systems and the processes that happen in an organization or at an institution. And to that last point, some people nuance balance. A lot of people have experienced forgiveness by saying there is no balance, right? The fact that we work 40 hours a week in our home on the weekend for 72 hours is a little out of whack. But I think there is space to say what specific measures are in place to help employees navigate or carve out their own personal well-being in this role. because we want people to practice well-being. I think that is a genuine desire of supervisors and of managers. I think in practice, what that looks like, oftentimes employees need it to be modeled, or for some of that advocacy and boundary setting to be put in place to make it possible. Right, Nisa talked about the new center in office. Well, if a supervisor at some point doesn't say these are our limitations, then 40 hours becomes 60 hours, becomes 80 hours. But a supervisor who advocates for those boundaries and says, we accept so many projects, when we hit this many projects, this is kind of the limit of our center, that can convey to an employee, we've hit our limit on projects because I really only want you to work X amount of hours and still be able to get your work done and still be able to meet deadlines. So I think for candidates, whether it's entry level as a grad student or thinking about the next position, but particularly as you move up and may become a supervisor, to ask specific questions about specific measures, how and why, those questions that leave it open-ended for employers to really have to talk about their structures and their systems and their processes. So thank you all for that really meaningful feedback. Going to pivot us just a little bit, particularly in higher ed. The average employee has a one-on-one for team meetings, staff meetings, but you also get one-on-ones with your supervisor, which I did not have in corporate. So I appreciate that about higher ed. In those spaces, you typically get to experience your supervisor as a coach and as a mentor, and not just as a manager of the systems and the processes that you fulfill. What are some of the things that you have found you needed from your supervisor in that one-on-one space as a coach and as a mentor? And you've hit on a lot of it with the emotional intelligence and decision-making, but are there additional things that you have needed from a supervisor as a coach and mentor in that one-on-one space?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. I kind of hinted at it earlier a little bit, but I think providing that valuable advice, especially like looking from a grad student's perspective again, and even previously in my role before entering the program, I think just advice in general about what's the next step, what are you going to do professionally, and how can I support you, but then also encouraging those new perspectives. So looking outside of what experiences you are getting in your role currently, and what can you do a little bit differently. So I think those are kind of the two biggest things for me.
I'll expand that question a little bit. Sticking with the one-on-one space, oftentimes supervisors will say, this is your time. You set the agenda. What are some things that you have brought on the agenda to your one-on-one with your supervisor that you would recommend folk potentially think about as supervisees getting that dedicated one-on-one time with their supervisor?
So I'm in my role as the talent management, the director of talent management. I'm about 5 months into this new role. And one of the things that has been important to me thinking about the spring semester is what are the cycles, right? So we know that in higher ed, there are these different cycles where, you know, like maybe in September, your work is super intense and you're focused on a particular thing. And then, you know, and then that kind of smooths out a little bit and then you go into a new cycle. And so it's helpful for me to know, to anticipate what those cycles are so that I can be planning for them. And so what I ask for from my supervisor is support in determining also what my priorities should be for my work, because I don't know about you all, but if you can imagine what it's like in higher ed, in human resources, there's no day that's the same. And so, you know, and so being able to know, well, I got this request from, you know, a vice president, should I be focusing my, you know, attention on that versus, you know, what I got from a manager in the health center, right? Like those, I think that those things are really important because it helps me to organize my workday, you know, and sort of plan out what the next month or 2 or 3 are going to look like for me. And then also for the folks that I supervise so that I can appropriately share information with them.
I think for me, sometimes I use that time to dig a little bit deeper into some other meetings that I've been a part of. So I sit on Dean's Council and we have our president's cabinet meetings, but sometimes things are mentioned and it's not in my functional area. So I don't know enough about that area to understand, that lingo, right? And so I'll use that time and space with my manager to say, hey, could you explain that a little bit more to me? And that helps, because I don't want to break off into this conversation and take away time and space in that meeting. So I try and use that time with my supervisor to just understand a little bit better and have a little bit more context. And in the California community college system, the college that I work at, we are a multi-college district. And so a lot of decisions that happen within our campus impact our sister colleges. And they're also connected to district functions. And so I also use that time to understand, okay, so why is our college approaching it this way, where we hear from our counterparts in these areas that they're doing it this way? And just, again, using that time to understand those nuances. Because that helps me in supervising my team and leading my team to kind of explain like, oh, well, you may have heard from your counterpart that they're doing X, Y, Z. Well, we don't have the full backstory, but here's a little bit more context behind why we're approaching it one way and another college is approaching it in a different way. And then a little bit connected to the topic, as a supervisee, I know this can't happen with every single, supervisee-supervisor relationship, but I have just enough of a personal relationship with my supervisor that they understand, me personally, right? What's my background, what's my family life look like? And so that helps them to understand my boundaries, right? And supporting me both personally and professionally, because they know that if I have a son with autism that I have a meeting I have to go to, they will advocate for me and be like, you know what, Nisa can't make that meeting because, and they don't have to go into detail as to why, but they will, help advocate in ways because they know enough about, what's going on with my personal life. So that has been helpful for me.
I think, go ahead, Carson.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, James. I think that there's two things for me that are kind of always standing on my one-on-one agendas that I come to my supervisors with. First is I'm a verbal processor. So having the ability to have dedicated time with my supervisor for like checks and balances of, hey, so I did this in my staff meeting this week and it didn't land the way that I anticipated it to, or my team completely derailed and this is where the conversation went. And I thought it was valuable. I didn't think it was valuable. This is where it landed. Can we like maybe process through this together to figure out how I can facilitate this type of a thing better in the future? Opportunities for learning and growth, and just space for me to pick the brain of somebody who I think will be able to give me good insight on how to become a better practitioner. The other thing that I think is particularly helpful is a standing meeting. I think a lot of this is strongly influenced by the last 2 years, is recognizing that I should hopefully have a better read on the student experience of the students that I interact with on a regular basis than my supervisor. Generally, as you kind of move up the supervision pyramid, people are less in touch with the student experience on an individual basis, right? The more you are in meetings and managing other people, the less time innately you have, if you practice a good work-life balance, to interact with students. It's something that I think needs to become more intentional the higher up you get in the administrative pyramid. And I think for me, it's my like duty and responsibility to advocate for things and changes in implementations of policy. And the reason I say that this is relevant right now is particularly thinking about COVID policy and the way that that is enforced in different spaces. It's like a roulette wheel, right? Like, this is the policy this week, this is the policy next week. Like, it might change tomorrow, I don't know. being able to have a constant stream of communication with my supervisor about this is the policy, this is the way I see it being implemented. But in reality, I'm actually seeing students like just forcing themselves off campus and they're just partying elsewhere. So we're trying to contain COVID, but in reality, we just don't have as much of an oversight on it as we might want to otherwise. So being able to, I think, pass along my perception of what the student experience is and how policy implementation is working in actuality, I think is something that is really important as somebody that I feel like has a better read on the student experience as my supervisor would be otherwise. So two things that I try to keep as kind of like standing items for me.
James, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we talked a little bit about feedback, and I think a lot of times when we think about feedback, we think about maybe critical feedback. But I think in one-on-ones, it is so refreshing to hear some positive feedback on things you've been doing. I think a lot of the times we do things and we're very proud of them, and being recognized for those, even if it isn't a one-on-one setting, is just so reassuring. And I think that that's something my supervisors do very well now. And it makes me want to be the best version of myself professionally and personally. So that's something I definitely appreciate. Even if it can only be in a one-on-one setting. Yeah, I think that's very important.
Thank you for that. We have hit 12:50, 12:51. And so I would love to ask one last question, because this is just the beginning of our series of conversations around supervision. There are a few other topics we're going to pick up in January, but we will continue to talk about supervision because it's so deeply impactful to our profession. And so I want to give each of you a chance to answer the question, how can strong supervision help move our field forward?
Well, from the HR perspective, I think as an HR professional, I think about the full cycle of recruitment. And, you know, in the HR world, we talk about recruitment as starting prior to you posting a job and ending well after the employee has left the job, right? Because the public image that your institution has a huge impact on your ability to successfully recruit really strong candidates. So I think that's one of the things that I approach my work with. And so feeding into that is the ability for managers to show up in some of the ways that we've talked about today. We, you know, like right now, you know, it's all the news is about this great exodus from higher ed. And, you know, some of it I think is management, and some of it is, you know, we have some really antiquated processes that we utilize both in our recruitment processes and then in our actual employee management processes that that just aren't serving us well. And so having managers who can advocate for the things that are like, versus just sort of maintaining the same old status, right? Like having people who can advocate for what is actually needed in order for them to retain their team members. So like one of the things that we're looking at Wake is compensation, and making sure that our compensation is either matching or leading what we see happening in the field. You know, there are universities that I'm aware of that during COVID not only didn't give increases, but also reduced people's compensation, which is just I don't know all of the reasons like that go into that kind of decision-making process, because we know that people no longer want to do all of this wonderfully hard work for pennies, right? So I think that's something that on a broader scale, we have to really confront and find some better approaches to. But then, you know, just in terms of the management, if you're a horrible boss, everyone who that person encounters when they leave your organization is going to know that you're a horrible boss, because like that's how we find out information. We find out information from our friends, from social media, you know, from all of the places now, and we're so well connected, you know, than maybe what we were 20 or 30 years ago. So like it's more difficult for someone to walk into an employment setting and be surprised by what they find, right? So I think that like managers are really, you know, they have like one of the biggest impacts on our ability to retain and grow this field.
I think for me, strong supervision, I think Harriet hit on something that I also very strongly believe in that I think ties into a bit of our earlier conversation of what the expectation of current students and the up and coming generations is. I think that currently we sit in a socio-political space where there's been a tremendous amount of empowerment in dismantling power structures, in challenging norms that exist in different spaces. I think that is also happening in the higher ed workforce. And I think that in order to maintain strong supervision, I think that you need to be a strong individual supervisor, but strongly doubling down on Harriet's point, I think that there needs to be institutional change to be able to justify and retain good staff in challenging some of those antiquated processes, in maintaining compensation relative to outside fields, to being able to find ways to justify work and tell stories of the employees and people that are working in ways that are going to both help elevate them and help them achieve the things that they want to out of their career, but also make sure that we are as progressive as we hope to be in a field of education, right, where we are teaching the next generation. College students right now and a lot of young professionals have blueprints on how to do that. We've seen that a lot socially, and to Harry's point again, the social perception, the value of that, of you as a supervisor and your institution is, I think, strongly precipitated on the individual supervision that comes from different people. So I think that an individual institution's capacity to do that is an amalgamation of all of the different supervisors that work at that institution, but also is really, I don't think that there's a capacity anymore to be like, I'm mad at this school. Like there's no disembodiment of like, I am frustrated with this entity. There's a human being, there's a human component to that entity that has been identified, and something or someone has to be able to answer and justify that. And I think strong supervision is really the turning point at which you start to see that start to change.
Chandler, what about you?
Yeah, I'll say for me, I think that's where thinking about the future in the field, I kind of go back to the beginning of the conversation when I was thinking about making sure we're doing the right work and that we're enjoying it, having that balance. So I think that's where for me, thinking about it, having that supervisor in that role, just to provide that support and advice to help us learn and make mistakes. And I think that's where once going through an experience as a grad student, that's where we're really going to be those next professionals that will take on those things that our good supervisors have done, and then those not so well supervisors that we've seen, and kind of just start this trend moving forward in the future as well.
James, then Nisa. Nisa, I'll let you have the last word.
Sure. So kind of just like what Chandler said, I think a lot about how if a person experiences bad supervision, how that that same those same processes might be replicated and mirrored as we move forward towards when we start supervising. And then, it becomes very cyclical, and eventually at some point, I kind of could take over the field in a way, and in a field that the retention isn't the absolute greatest with new professionals. I think that being able to stop that trend, being able to identify what bad supervision is and having a good understanding of it so that we don't replicate it, that we also don't supervise from a place of trauma from poor supervision, and we're able to end that kind of any trend or experience that we have, I think is going to allow us to move forward in a better direction towards good supervision, and mirroring those things that we've learned that have been exemplified for us.
Appreciate that.
I can't echo enough of what our colleagues have already shared. I mean, I share the same sentiments. I mean, really, it comes down to, supervision helping to create that culture, that environment, but also centering who our students are today and who our students will be tomorrow, right? And just making sure that our supervision and all the things that we do always have that at the center of our decision making. Because again, the policies and procedures, et cetera, that's going to drive a lot of it, but we have to humanize it, and understanding who our students will also help us to lead as supervisors and really shape that culture for our students, and who will eventually take on our roles in the field.
I think that's a beautiful last word, no pressure. To our conversationalists, thank you for your time today for this hour. I have copious notes. You have dropped lots of gems of wisdom. For those of you who joined us as guests to listen in, I hope that it was a good hour for you, that you heard some things that will spark you to ask questions, or to think about what it will mean for you to supervise if that's the path that you're on, or some things that you can take into interactions with your current supervisor as a supervisee. Again, we thank you. We appreciate you for your time. Happy winter break to everyone. I hope there is some sort of break for each of you. And we look forward to sharing more from TPE with you in 2022. Take care.